They called it the forgotten African empire that crushed Rome. And tonight, we walk straight into its most decisive hour, the Battle of Ad Decimum. 533 AD, Carthage breathes hot in the late summer, its walls watching the sea like a patient predator. 10 milestones south, the land sinks into a narrow ravine where the road tightens and men die. A single decision taken in a cloud of dust will decide whether the Eastern Roman Empire reclaims Africa, or whether the kingdom that once sacked Rome in 455 keeps its throne of grain, gold, and fear. Here is the surprise most people never hear. The general sent to take it back brings barely 15,000 men across a hostile sea, betting an empire on speed, discipline, and nerve. The Vandals are split, their king certain he can crush the invader at this choke point, certain the desert itself will help. But as the sun rises over that 10th milestone, a brother rides too soon, steel flashes, and an omen spills into the dust. What happened next? No historian expected. The voice of the earth holds its breath. Hooves drum, helmets glitter. Somewhere in the haze, a commander lifts his hand and fate waits to see if it is steady. Empire of fire and silence, they called it the forgotten African empire that crushed Rome. But before swords crossed at Ad Decimum, the land itself seemed to whisper warnings. Africa 533 AD, the sun carved gold from the sea, and across that shimmering horizon came sails bearing an old ambition, Rome reborn. Yet the kingdom waiting on these shores had once burned the eternal city itself. Its kings ruled from Carthage with silver crowns and silent memories of conquest. Most people never knew this detail, but for nearly a century, the Vandals held the wealth of the Mediterranean in their hands, their ships cutting through trade routes like blades through silk. Rome had feared them, bargained with them, cursed them, and now they were about to face them again. Only this time, the army coming for them was smaller, faster, and led by a man whose calm could break storms. His name was Belisarius, and what he would do in Africa would decide whether Rome still had a future, or whether the desert would keep its empire of ghosts forever. But fate, as always, had other plans. Carthage glittered like a mirage, marbled ports lined with ships resting on calm water, its temples still echoing with the prayers of two civilizations. Beneath the bright sun, men in white cloaks whispered of Rome's return. The Vandals ruled, yes, but they had begun to rot from the inside. Their kings spoke of faith and purity, while their nobles drowned in wine and gold. In the great hall of Carthage, King Gelimor sat beneath, mosaics showing victories long past. He was not a man of indulgence. His eyes were sharp, his words measured. He had inherited an empire, not built at hand. He could feel it slipping, grain by grain, through his fingers. News arrived from Sardinia. His brother Dazau was still suppressing a revolt there. The timing was cruel. Scouts brought word that Roman sails had been spotted off the Libyan coast. Gelimor's heart beat once, slow and steady. He knew this was no rumor. Justinian's shadow had finally stretched across the sea, across that same sea. Aboard a flagship of the Eastern Empire stood Belisarius young, stern, with a kind of face that looked born for command. He watched the African coast emerge from mist, his men murmuring prayers and curses. To most of them, this was another campaign. To him, it was a test. He had fought Persians on mountain passes, held cities with impossible odds, and now carried the weight of an emperor's ambition, the dream of reuniting Rome's broken world. They landed at Kaiput Vodun welcome, uncelebrated, under a sun that made armor burn. The sand clung to their boots as if the earth itself wanted to drag them back into the sea. Belisarius ordered discipline from the first moment. No looting, no chaos, no Roman arrogance. We win hearts first, he said, then cities. Villagers watched the army march by in eerie silence, the smell of salt and sweat thick in the air. They remembered the Vandals' cruelty. Now they saw a different kind of conqueror, silent, organized, merciful. The desert listened. Each night, the fires of the Roman camp burned steady. Scouts moved like ghosts ahead of the column, measuring the land, counting the wells. Belisarius rode among his men without splendor, his armor dusty, his voice low. To his aide, he said, "This land remembers Rome, but will it remember justice?" Meanwhile, Gelamor gathered his council in Carthage. Maps sprawled across tables, showing the old Roman roads that still cut through the African wilderness. "They're few," he said, tracing the route from Caput Vada northward. 15,000 perhaps. We will not face them in open field. We will crush them where the land itself narrows to a blade. He pointed to a small mark, Ad Decimum, the 10th milestone. Here we end them. 3 parts of his army would move like jaws of a trap. His brother Amytas would hold the defile south of Carthage, blocking the advance. His nephew Gebamund would swing wide through the plains to strike the Roman flank. Gelamar himself would strike from behind with the main host once the enemy was entangled. It was perfect if timing obeyed him. But timing is the most treacherous ally in war. For Belisarius, the days became a slow tightening of the world. The road was ancient, straight as empire, broken as memory. Carthage's towers shimmered faintly ahead, always out of reach. The army moved with the rhythm of endurance. Heat by day, cold by night, the creak of leather and the murmur of prayers. In the distance, smoke-coiled villages abandoned before they arrived. Fear traveled faster than hoofbeats. One night, as the moon carved pale light over the desert, a Roman scout staggered back with a strange report. No resistance, no armies, only silence. Belisarius frowned. Silence was never mercied, was design. "Then they're waiting," he murmured. He looked over the map, and his finger paused exactly where Gelamor's had days before Decimum. "They'll come for us there." The morning before the march, a faint breeze rolled in from the sea. The men felt it as a blessing. Belisarius felt it as a warning. "Keep tight," he told his officers. "The enemy is not ahead of us. He is around us." But destiny, that patient hunter, was already moving its pieces. Amytas, Gelamor's brother, misread the dawn. Driven by pride or perhaps the urge to prove himself, he rode too soon toward Ad Decimum. His escort half-formed, his scouts unready. The sun climbed, the dust rose, and the first blood of the coming storm began to stir. Carthage waited beyond the horizon, her walls catching the first light like a promise or a threat. The desert wind carried the sound of hooves, faint and steady. Somewhere between two worlds, between the fading empire of Rome and the kingdom that once destroyed it. Single mistake was about to decide which would rise again, and this is where everything changes. The road of 10 milestones, the road to Carthage, was older than memory laid by Romans, ruled by Vandals, and now echoing once more beneath the march of destiny. Dust clung to the sandals of 15,000 men, each carrying the weight of an empire that refused to die. Ahead lay a land silent as breath before a storm. To the north, Carthage's white towers shimmered like ghosts in the heat. To the south, the desert whispered secrets, and between them Ad Decimum, the 10th milestone. No one spoke its name without unease. It was narrow, sun-scorched, a place where armies vanished. Most people never knew this detail, but the road there ran between 2 ridges shaped like jaws, waiting to close. What no one could see, what even fate held its breath to witness, was how one heartbeat, one decision, would twist the outcome of history itself. The march began before dawn. A thin red line of soldiers stretched across the horizon, their shields glinting in the first light. Belisarius rode at the center, flanked by his guard stoic eyes forward. Every sound was amplified by the silence. The scrape of sandals, the creak of leather straps, the murmured prayers of men who had never seen Africa before. By midday, the heat became merciless. The road shimmered, mirage upon mirage, and every shadow looked like an ambush waiting to wake. "Keep the ranks tight," Belisarius called. "They strike. Let them find a wall, not a trail." His voice carried calm authority, the kind that steadied hearts even as death loomed unseen. Behind him, his wife Antonina rode in a supply cart, her veil drawn. History rarely mentions her here, but she was there, sharp-minded, loyal, watching her husband with eyes that saw both man and legend. "You do not fear them," she said quietly once. Belisarius had smiled without looking back. Fear keeps armies alive. Arrogance buries them. Ahead, the scouts rode in a fan pattern, spreading thin to taste the wind. By late afternoon, one returned to Numidian with sun-scorched skin and the expression of someone who had seen too much. "Movement," he reported. "Riders perhaps 50. Far to the right, watching us." Belisarius nodded. "Let them. When a hunter shows his face, it means he wants you to see him. The real danger hides behind the hill." In Carthage, Gelimer's orders moved like fire through oil. Amytas had already left with his vanguard, eager to prove himself. Bamond, the young nephew, prepared to sweep wide through the plains. Gelimer, confident, gathered his main host and spoke to his captains beneath the shadow of the city's gates. "When the Romans pass Ad Decimum, we strike as one," he said. "They are few. They are far from home. The road will betray them." But fate was already threading a new pattern into his design. Amytas reached Ad Decimum too soon. He was supposed to wait to hold position until Gelimer and Bamond closed in. Instead, impatience or perhaps destiny drove him forward. He rode ahead of his men, a small escort at his back, the dust of their horses rising like a warning to the gods. On the ridge above, Roman scouts caught sight of them. They didn't know it yet, but history had just stepped out of the shadows. John, the Armenian commander of Belisarius's advance guard, was the first to engage. He saw the approaching riders, assumed they were a probing force, and moved to push them back. The clash was swift, violent, and over almost before it began. Spears met flesh, sand turned red, and when the dust cleared, Amytas lay dead cut down by chance in the opening moves of a battle that had not yet begun. What happened next? The chroniclers wrote. No one expected. The death of Amytas sent a ripple through the Vandal ranks. His men hesitated, then broke, fleeing toward Carthage with the news. The left jaw of Gelimer's trap had just collapsed. No one yet knew it. When word reached Belisarius, he said nothing for a long while. Only his eyes changed. He had fought enough wars to recognize when the gods were whispering through chaos. "Advance slowly," he ordered, "but hold formation. The enemy will not understand what's happened. Not yet." Meanwhile, miles away, Bamond was already on the move. His cavalry, tall, blond, and fierce, rode in wide arcs through the plains, dust trailing behind like a comet's tail. He believed Amytas still held the pass. He believed the trap was ready to spring. But in war, belief is the cruelest deception. Belisarius's flanking scouts spotted him first, riders cutting fast across the horizon. The Roman general sent word to his allied Hunnic cavalry archers who rode like the wind itself. "Do not wait for orders," he told their commander. "Break them before they reach us." The Huns needed no encouragement. They thundered out across the sand, small, lean men on thick-necked horses, their bows already strung. When the Vandals saw them coming, they mistook them for a screen of scouts until the arrows began to fall. The air filled with the hiss of death. Horses screamed, men tumbled, and Bamon's flank force shattered before it ever struck. In less than an hour, the second jaw of Gelimer's trap was gone. Most people never knew this detail. The battle at Ad Decimum was decided not by overwhelming numbers, but by timing, by who hesitated and who didn't. Gelimer was still on the march, still believing that Amytas held the pass and that Bamon's flank would soon crash into Roman ranks. He did not yet know he was alone. As the sun dipped lower, Belisarius paused his advance. Dust clouds to the rear told him Gelimer's main host was coming fast. He turned to his aide. "We hold here," he said. "The defile narrows ahead. If they strike, we strike back, where their numbers mean nothing." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but every man around him understood the weight behind it. The army shifted into position, shields braced, spears angled, cavalry ready to surge. Then, the unexpected. The first messengers of victory arrived, breathless, reporting Amytas' death and Bamon's defeat. Belisarius looked east, where the sky was turning the color of blood. "Two jaws broken," he murmured. "Now the king himself comes." But fate had something else planned. Gelimer rode at the head of his army, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When the field of Ad Decimum came into view, he saw Boudicca's brothers Menand, then, lying among them, Amytas himself. The world tilted. The king dismounted, walked to the body, and knelt. He wept not as a ruler, but as a brother. For precious minutes, the Vandal army stood waiting behind him, confused, unmoving, as their commander performed funeral rites in the middle of the battlefield. Those minutes would cost him everything. Belisarius, unaware of the exact reason for the delay, seized the moment. He reformed his line, brought his cavalry forward, and began to press. The Romans advanced like a slow, tide-steady, relentless. When Gelimer finally rose from his grief, he saw not opportunity, but encirclement. Night approached with the speed of panic. Horns sounded, commands blurred. The Vandal formation broke against the discipline of Rome's resurgent legions. Yet even then, chaos-carried mercy darkness fell before annihilation could finish its work. Gelimer pulled his remnants back toward the hills, leaving the road to Carthage open. By dawn, Belisarius stood upon the 10th milestone, his armor streaked with dust, his face unreadable. His men cheered, but he only watched the horizon. "This isn't victory yet," he said softly. "The lion is wounded, not dead." Behind him, the road stretched south, silent now, save for the wind moving over forgotten bodies. Ahead, Carthage waited, unaware that the gates of its destiny were about to open. And this is where everything changes once again. For vengeance was sailing back across the sea. The ambush uncoils the morning after. Ad Decimum smelled of dust, sweat, and iron. The battlefield lay silent, broken only by the crackle of burning carts and the cries of wounded men who would never see Carthage again. The vultures had already begun to circle, patient, ancient witnesses of human folly. And yet amid this stillness one truth burned brighter than the sun. A Roman army, outnumbered, stranded on foreign soil, had shattered a kingdom that once sacked Rome itself. But fate was not done. Because across the sea, vengeance was coming home, riding the tide in black sails. Led by a man who still believed Africa belonged to the Vandals. Carthage's walls glittered in the heat. The city, proud and trembling, had watched the smoke rising from the south. Messengers galloped through the gates, shouting conflicting tales. Some said Gelimer had triumphed, others that he had fallen. Truth, as always, lagged behind rumor. But when the first battered soldiers stumbled in, eyes wide with loss, Carthage understood. Their king had been defeated. The Roman eagle had returned. Belisarius did not march immediately. He knew the battle had been won by fate's missteps as much as by his own skill. Victory born of accident is no victory. He told his officers that evening as the wounded were carried past. "We hold until we know the enemy's next breath." His men admired his caution, though they longed for glory. Many had expected a grand assault on Carthage that very night, but Belisarius, ever the strategist, had learned that haste is the language of defeat. At dawn, scouts brought word that Gelamor had fled westward into the hills. The Vandal army, fractured and humiliated, was scattering. Some headed toward the mountains, others toward the coast. But Belisarius' eyes turned not to the fleeing king, but to Carthage itself, its harbor gleaming with ships, its walls lined with archers, its citizens watching the horizon as if history might yet reverse itself. He rode at the head of his column that morning. The road was eerily calm. No ambushes, no resistance, only wind and the occasional shimmer of heat. When the army finally crested the last ridge, they saw it. Carthage, the jewel of Africa, the city of Dido and Hannibal, standing proud against the sea. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Even hardened veterans felt something ancient stir in their chests. "Rome," one whispered, "has come home." Belisarius gave a single order: no plunder, no fire, no vengeance. "We take it as Romans." And so they entered Carthage not as raiders, but as restorers. The gates opened without a fight. The garrison had fled in the night. Citizens watched from balconies, torn between awe and disbelief. For almost a century, no Roman standard had flown above those walls. Now the crimson banner of the Eastern Empire unfurled again, catching the African wind. The sight sent shivers through the city. Old men wept. Children pointed. Even the sea seemed to pause. But here's the shocking truth Belisarius did not celebrate. He ordered the men to rebuild broken aqueducts, to restore the baths and granaries, to treat the city not as a prize, but as a responsibility. The army slept inside barracks, not in temples or homes. His discipline turned occupation into order. And while his soldiers marveled at the beauty of Carthage, the marble columns, the mosaics glittering like frozen sunlight, Belisarius sat alone in the governor's palace, studying the map of Africa under candlelight. "Gelamor will not run forever," he said quietly to his aide. "He will gather what's left. And when he returns, it will not be for negotiation. It will be for vengeance." His words proved prophecy. Far across the sea, in Sardinia, Gelamor's brother Dazazzo was crushing rebels when a ship arrived, torn by wind and grief. The messenger fell to his knees. "Your brother, defeated, Amita's dead. Gbamond slain. The Romans hold Carthage." Zazo stared, silent. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned to his captains. "Raise every sail. Leave nothing behind. Africa burns, and we are the fire that will cleanse it." Within days, a fleet of Vandal warships cut through the Mediterranean, their sails black against the setting sun. The sound of drums rolled over the water like thunder. The same sea that once carried the Vandals to Rome's gates now carried them back toward their own lost kingdom. Most people never knew this detail, but when those ships appeared on the horizon near Africa, the fishermen of Carthage stopped their nets mid-haul and whispered, "The dead return." Meanwhile, inside the city, Belisarius prepared. He repaired walls, fortified gates, and gathered local allies, Berber riders, African peasants, even captured Vandal soldiers who would rather live under Rome than die for a fading king. Every night he climbed to the ramparts and watched the sea, waiting for the shape of vengeance to rise from the waves. And one morning it did. A watchman's cry shattered the dawn. "Sails to the west." Belisarius rushed to the walls. The horizon was dark, with ships and armada cutting straight for Carthage. His officers tensed. Some panicked. But Belisarius' expression did not change. "He's coming for his home," he said. "Then we'll remind him who it truly belongs to." Zazo's fleet landed near Bulla Regia, and soon after, Gelamor joined him, his sorrow burned into resolve. The brothers embraced on the shore, surrounded by banners bearing the golden cross of the Vandals. This time, Gelamor said, "No mistakes, no mercy." Zazo nodded. "This time, we fight as one." And so the Vandal army rose again, fierce, united, vengeful. They moved eastward toward Carthage, burning every Roman outpost along the way. Villages that had welcomed Belisarius days earlier now screamed under Vandal retribution, the air filled with smoke and vengeance. "Tell your emperor," Gelamor declared, "Africa will be our tomb before it becomes his." Inside Carthage, tension thickened like storm clouds. Rumors whispered through the streets. Some said Gelamor's army was twice as large. Others that the city would burn before dawn. Soldiers polished their armor in silence, aware that the next battle would decide not just victory, but survival. Belisarius gathered his captains in the great hall. Candlelight flickered across their faces. "He will come soon," he said. "And when he does, he will think we fear him. We will let him think so. Then we break him clanly, completely, forever." "But, General," one officer asked, "should we not await reinforcements from the emperor?" Belisarius smiled faintly. "Reinforcements are for those who can afford time. Time is the one thing Africa will not give us." Outside, the city trembled under the approaching thunder of war. Civilians prayed, some fled, others clutched relics from forgotten gods. The harbor winds howled, as if ancient Carthage itself could feel that history was repeating that once again. Its fate hung between empire and ashes. By sunset, riders brought the news. Gelamor and Zazo were near less than a day's march. The Vandals camped under the stars, their fires burning like defiance against the horizon. Belisarius stood on the ramparts that night, watching those fires flicker. His officers waited for him to speak. Instead, he whispered something only the wind could hear. "They think they are the storm, but they forget we have weathered worse." And as darkness fell, the city slept uneasily, knowing that when dawn came, Africa would choose its master once more. The drums began before sunrise. Low, steady, relentless. A sound older than fear. The second battle for Carthage was coming. And this is where everything changes again. When the sun turned before dawn, Carthage held its breath. The sea was calm, the air sharp with salt and smoke. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the rhythm of war drums rolled across the plains. The Vandals had returned, 2 brothers leading one last army. Their pride and grief, bound together like steel and flame. Most people never knew this detail, but the morning wind carried both the scent of the sea and the distant chant of vengeance. And in that wind, the sun rose, blood red. Belisarius stood atop the eastern wall, the first light touching his armor. Below, the Roman ranks formed spearmen in ordered blocks. Cavalry tightening reins, archers unstringing their bows. He looked over them not as a man hungry for glory, but as one haunted by its cost. "They'll come fast," he told his officers. "They've lost their home once already." Men who fight for what's gone have nothing to fear but memory. Inside the city, the citizens watched in silence. The clatter of gates closing sounded like a sentence. Market stalls were abandoned, fountains stilled. The same streets that had once cheered Vandal kings now braced for the echo of Roman commands. By midday, the dust on the western road thickened. The Vandal army appeared, a wave of bronze, blue, and sun-bleached banners, their spears glinting like the sea. At their head rode Gelamor and Tazaz, brothers reborn from defeat. Gelamor's face was harder now, stripped of sorrow. His brother leaned close, voice low. "We take back Carthage, or we die at its gates." The horns sounded. The Vandals advanced. Belisarius did not move his army immediately. He watched, reading the rhythm, sensing the pulse of the approaching storm. His aides shifted nervously. "They'll surround us if we wait," one warned. "Good," Belisarius replied. "Then we won't have to look for them." At the third blast of the Vandal horns, the Roman gates opened. The cavalry burst forth, Huns in the lead, their bows singing as they loosed arrows into the sun. The Vandals roared back, their lines slamming forward in fury. The ground shook with hooves and cries, the air thick with dust. The second battle for Carthage had begun. The first clash was chaos. Arrows screamed through the air, cutting down men and horses alike. The Vandals' front line pressed hard, driving into the Roman center. For a moment, it seemed the old kingdom might rise again. The desert itself favored them. Gelamor led from the front, his sword flashing as he cut through shields and flesh. The Vandals cheered, sensing the Romans bending. But Belisarius was waiting. His strategy unfolded like a trapdoor opening underfoot. The Roman flanks, which had seemed thin, now curved inward, enclosing the Vandal charge in a crescent of steel. The cavalry swung wide behind them, cutting their escape. Within minutes, the battlefield turned from triumph to terror. What happened next? The chroniclers wrote, no man could have foreseen. As Gelamor drove deeper into Roman lines, he suddenly realized the ground beneath him was choked with bodies wearing his own colors. His brother's voice reached him faintly through the din, "Hold the right. Hold," then vanished under the roar of combat. Dazaz's unit, holding the right flank, was hit full force by Belisarius' reserve cavalry. The impact was brutal, final. The Vandal prince fell amid his household guard, a Roman spear through his chest. When word reached Gelamor, it was as if the world had torn in two. He froze. For the second time in as many months, he saw a brother's blood on African soil. But this time, there was no time to mourn. The Romans pressed harder, their discipline unbroken, their formation tightening like a noose. Gelamor's heart cracked, and his will with it. Belisarius saw the hesitation just a flicker and struck. He signaled his flanking wings, and the Roman line surged. "Forward!" his captains cried. The sky seemed to tilt. The Vandals broke. What had begun as vengeance dissolved into flight. Carthage watched from its walls as the battle spilled away toward the hills. Dust swallowed the fleeing soldiers, their banners vanishing one by one. Belisarius ordered no pursuit. He knew victory could turn to disaster in the blink of pride. Instead, he raised his sword and signaled the recall. The horns of Rome sang through Africa once more. That night, silence returned. Fires burned outside the city, their glow flickering across the sea. Inside, citizens wept not from fear this time, but from the strange, trembling awe of survival. Carthage, for the first time in a century, belonged to Rome again. But here's the shocking truth. Gelamor still lived, fleeing into the mountains of Numidia. He carried with him the last embers of his kingdom and the hope, however faint, that the land itself might protect him. Belisarius knew this story wasn't finished. A man who loses everything becomes dangerous, he told his wife. Even mercy cannot bind him. Days turned into weeks. Gelamor hid among the Berber tribes, hunted, half-starved, his crown traded for bread. He sent envoys begging for peace, but when the Roman messengers arrived, he could not meet their eyes. Pride, the old poison, still pulsed in his veins. It was winter when the end came. Cornered in the mountains, surrounded by soldiers who once feared his name, Gelamor finally surrendered. When he was brought before Belisarius, the once mighty king refused to kneel, but his voice broke as he whispered a single phrase: "Vanity of vanities. All is vanity." Belisarius did not gloat. He looked at the fallen ruler and saw not an enemy, but the echo of an empire undone by time. "Even the victors serve history," he said softly. And so, with the capture of Gelamor, the African kingdom of the Vandals vanished from the earth. Rome reclaimed its lost province. The emperor in Constantinople would call it divine destiny. But for those who had walked the blood-soaked fields of Ad Decimum and Carthage, it felt less like Justinian, more like the weary sigh of a world that had forgotten how to rest. Yet the story was not over. In the streets of Carthage, among the broken stones and newly raised banners, the question lingered like smoke. Could empire truly rise again without becoming what it once destroyed? The answer would echo far beyond Africa, because Belisarius Rome's quiet storm was not done. And what came next would make even emperors tremble. The fall of Carthage. The wind over Carthage carried two voices that dayed: the voice of triumph and the voice of ghosts. The Roman eagle rose again above the city's white walls, but beneath that shining banner there was no celebration. Only the hollow sound of hammers rebuilding what war had broken, and the murmur of prayers whispered for the dead. Most people never knew this detail, but when Belisarius entered the governor's palace after victory, he ordered no feast, no parade, no wreaths. Instead, he asked for a chair, a candle, and silence. Because he knew the hardest battles always begin after the war. Carthage breathed again, yet uneasily. The streets were full of Roman soldiers, now disciplined, courteous, but foreign. Merchants reopened their stalls, priests sang again in old basilicas, and coins bearing Justinian's face replaced the Vandals' gold. The city that had once trembled under Germanic rule was now under Roman order, but under the calm, tension smoldered. The Africans, Roman by ancestry, Vandal by habit, watched their new masters with wary eyes. They had seen too many flags rise and fall. Belisarius knew this. He had seen empires crumble, not from conquest, but from arrogance. Every night he walked the port alone, listening to the creak of ships and the whispers of sailors. His men called him the Silent Hawk. He didn't argue. Pride, he told his aide Procopius, is the disease that killed Carthage once before. It won't kill it again while I draw breath. Procopius, historian, soldier, and witness, wrote later, he ruled Africa as a soldier governs himself with discipline, restraint, and the certainty that power without humility is just another form of ruin. Yet fate, patient and cruel, was not finished with him. In the mountains, Gelamor lived on as a shadow. Though captured, he was not broken. Word of his dignity spread through the tribes, how he refused to beg for mercy, how he sang psalms when brought in chains to Constantinople. The Emperor Justinian welcomed him with ceremony, but there was bitterness beneath the gold. Belisarius had returned victorious, too victorious perhaps. The court whispered, a general loved by his men, adored by cities, victorious in lands once lost such men. Emperors begin to fear. When Belisarius entered the hippodrome of Constantinople, the city erupted. Tens of thousands shouted his name. Behind him marched prisoners, Vandal nobles in torn finery, their king silent, his crown carried before him on a spear. At the end of the procession, Gelamor halted before Justinian, and, as the crowd fell silent, spoke softly, "Vanity of vanities. All is vanity." It was not defiance, it was truth. Spoken from the ruins of empire, Belisarius bowed deeply before the emperor, but in his heart something shifted. He had rebuilt Carthage, restored Africa, toppled a kingdom that had once humiliated Rome, and still he felt no joy, only exhaustion. Victory, he told Procopius that night, is just another form of loss. You lose something of yourself every time you win. Back in Africa, the new Roman rule was fragile. Corrupt governors replaced noble captains. Tribute collectors grew fat, while the people grew silent. The same empire that had come as liberator now began to tighten its grip like a conqueror. In the courtyards where children once played, soldiers now drilled. The streets that had echoed with hymns now whispered with resentment. History was repeating itself as it always did. One evening, as Belisarius prepared to leave Africa, an old priest came to him at the harbor. His robes were worn, his eyes clouded with time. "You have restored Rome," the priest said. "But tell me, General, has Rome restored itself?" Belisarius did not answer at first. He looked out to the sea where the sun was bleeding into the horizon. "Rome," he said finally, "is a memory that still thinks it's a kingdom." The priest smiled faintly. "Then may you remember well when memory turns to ash." The fleet sailed east at dawn. The citizens of Carthage stood by the docks, waving as the ships drifted into the distance. Some cried, some spat. All wondered if this peace would last or if new chains would soon replace the old. And yet, as the coastline faded, something stirred in the hearts of those left behind. Carthage had survived again. Burned by Romans, ruled by Vandals, reclaimed by Byzantines, it still stood. Its people still bartered, prayed, dreamed. Empires came and went, but the city endured, like a scar that refused to fade. On the deck, Belisarius stood alone, the wind tearing at his cloak. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the promise of the next war glimmered faintly. "Africa is quiet," Procopius said beside him. "For now," Belisarius replied. "But peace is only the pause between storms. And this is where everything changes again, because the general who conquered Africa was about to face something greater than armies, his own empire's suspicion, jealousy, and betrayal. The wars of men were ending. The wars of ambition were about to begin. Echoes of empire, they said. Belisarius conquered Africa, but few remembered what Africa conquered in him. The man who had crushed the Vandals and restored the pride of Rome now sailed home not to triumph, but to suspicion. The cheers that once echoed across Carthage's walls now faded into whispers in Constantinople's marble halls. Most people never knew this detail, but when he walked into the capital with victory at his back, the emperor did not smile. The city received him with splendor. Banners draped from every arch, incense thick as fog, children throwing petals before his horse. Yet, behind the celebration, eyes followed him cold, measuring political. In the crowd's roar, Belisarius could hear the rustle of envy. Inside the palace, Justinian rose from his throne, his face unreadable. "Africa is ours again," he said. Belisarius knelt. "Rome's flame still burns, Majesty," he answered. But the emperor's gaze lingered on him a moment too long, and the silence that followed felt heavier than gratitude. That night, as the feasting began, courtiers drank and laughed. But Belisarius did not stay. He slipped out into the quiet colonnades, the sea wind brushing his cloak. Antonina found him there. "You should smile," she said softly. "You won a kingdom." He shook his head. "I only borrowed one, and Rome. We'll find a way to lose it again." Months passed. Africa stabilized under Roman rule, but corruption began to rot it from within. Governors sent to replace Belisarius drained the land of wealth, raising new taxes, silencing old allies. In Carthage, soldiers grumbled. Peasants whispered that maybe the Vandals had been better masters. The same roads that once carried victory now carried despair. The empire, reborn in glory, was beginning to eat itself alive. Belisarius saw it coming. He had seen it in Persia, in Africa, in the tired eyes of every soldier who bled for a dream that could never stay whole. The empire could conquer any enemy except itself. Then came the next summons. War again. Italy this time. Rome itself had fallen to barbarians once more. Justinian needed his general, the same man he now feared, to save the eternal city. Belisarius obeyed. He always obeyed. One last campaign, he told Antonina, though both knew it would never truly be the last. Before he left, He walked once more through the halls of the palace, where gold mosaics glimmered with scenes of old victories. The faces of long-dead emperors stared down like silent judges. "They thought they were eternal," he murmured. "So did I." He led his army west through storms, hunger, and betrayal, reclaiming Rome in the name of an empire that no longer deserved it. He fought not for power, but for memory, for the idea that something noble could still live inside a dying world. But history is cruel to its heroes. When he returned, triumphant again, the same city that had cheered him once more turned cold. Justinian's advisors accused him of disloyalty. "Too popular," they whispered. "Too beloved." The emperor listened. Belisarius was stripped of command, his titles erased, his name tarnished by rumor. Some say he was blinded, begging for alms at the gates of the very city he once saved. Others say he died quietly, content only that his conscience remained unbroken. But the truth, like all great legends, was somewhere in between. What mattered was not how he ended, but what he left behind, a warning carved in silence, because long after the Vandals vanished, after Carthage fell and rose and fell again, after empires burned and were rebuilt, one truth remained: power never satisfies. It only hungers, and yet, across centuries, Belisarius' name endured not as a conqueror, but as a paradox, the loyal servant of a faithless empire, the warrior who brought Rome back from death, only to be buried beneath its jealousy. When the sun sets over the ruins of Carthage today, the wind still whispers through the broken columns. It carries two names, Gelamor and Belisarius, two men bound by war, pride, and destiny. One lost his crown, the other lost his peace. Both lost their place in the world they fought to save, and so, on that blood-soaked land where empires collided and vanished, the earth keeps its silence. But if you listen closely, beneath the waves that break against the African shore, you can still hear the echo of Rome, the sound of an empire trying to remember why it ever called itself eternal, because in the end, history doesn't remember who conquered whom. It only remembers who stood when the sun turned red and refused to fall.